Hey, welcome back to Business 101. And this week we have one activity that we are going to chat about in this video, and that is your midterm exam number one. This video serves only one purpose, and that is a review for your midterm exam. All right, so what I typically do with exams, I try to give you every possible advantage to know exactly what will be on the exam. While the exam is intended to be closed note and closed book, at the same time, I believe that it's really in everyone's best interest to really know what to study for, what is really going to be on the exam, and how to best prepare for that, as opposed to, for instance, just telling you, hey, anything in the textbook is fair game, which I categorically think is rather unfair way to approach exams. So let's give you a little bit of logistics, what to expect on this midterm exam this week, just the basic format and how it will be released. All right, so the exam itself will be taken entirely over Canvas, like your quizzes, just entirely in Canvas. And it will generally be 43 questions long, and you will have 90 minutes, an hour and a half, to complete those 43 questions. Now, of course, if you have already forwarded to me formal accommodations from Student Services, and if you have additional time granted to you through a formal accommodation, I've already built that into the exam for you. But generally speaking, it is intended as a 90-minute exam. The exam will have 3 different types of questions on them. That will be a small handful of true and false questions, a small handful of short answer questions, which will be very much like your quiz questions have been, right? And then the great balance of the questions will be multiple choice. In terms of points and score, the true-false questions are all worth 1 point. The 1 point each. The multiple choice questions will each be worth 1 point. The short answer questions, however, will each be worth 4 points, and therefore, obviously it is in your best interests to do well on those short answer questions. And like the quiz questions, they are not intended to be essays. You don't have to write multiple paragraphs or anything like that. It's intended to be a short answer. However, I would tell you, you need to be mindful to address every single point of the question that I'm asking. I generally have been pretty liberal and easy on the quizzes. However, on an exam, if, for instance, I ask you, define this term and give me 2 examples, you need to give me 2 examples, not 1 example, not no examples. You have to give me 2 examples, or you will not get full points for that question. You must give me a proper definition if I'm asking for one, or you will not get full points for the question. I hope that's clear, right? While, if you've been sort of in the neighborhood, I've been very gracious in my grading on the quizzes. On the exam, you need to make sure you review the question so you're answering and responding to every part of that question. Alrighty? Now, I'm releasing the exam today, Tuesday, and it will be open on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and the exam will close on Friday at 11:59 p.m. This means that you may enter into and take the exam anytime during this 4-day period. Anytime that it's open on Tuesday, all day Wednesday, all day Thursday, Friday, up to 11:59 p.m. And once you enter the exam, it must be completed in one single sitting. Therefore, obviously make sure your laptop is charged up and you've got good Wi-Fi and all that good stuff. All right, so that's the basic logistics for the exam. All right, you should also know that because the small number of short answer questions are worth 4 points, right? While you have 43 questions, the entire exam is worth 58 points, right? More points for the short answer questions, right? So when you submit the exam, it will score the true and false questions and the multiple choice questions automatically, right? You hit the submit button, boom, a score will come back. And if you keep in mind, of course, right, that the short answer questions, I have to grade manually, right? Those aren't graded by the system. What that means is you hit the submit button and you may get back, your score is a 42 or a 41. And you may be saying, oh, man, that's not even an A because it's worth 58 points. Well, remember, I still have to grade all those short answer questions manually. So don't be disappointed in the number you get back. Remember, there's still, these short answer questions that will be graded after you hit the submission button. All right. So generally speaking, that's the logistics you need to know for this exam. As I said, it is intended to be closed note, closed book. I will not be proctoring the exam. We will generally deal with academic honesty on the honor system. And at this point, then, the rest of this video is intended to review each of the modules that this exam covers and to let you know what content you need to have under your belt. All right, so this midterm exam covers modules 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. In other words, well, basically all the modules that you've gotten to date in this class. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's start at the beginning. All right. Module number 1 has to do with economic systems, competition, supply and demand. This is the very first module you got, right? So you will need to know what is our definition of business. Why are we studying private sector for-profit businesses in this class, right? You'll need to know the definition of profit, right? Profit, that equation I gave you, a very important equation I gave you the first module in class, right? Profit equals revenue minus expenses, right? Revenue is what you pay for the sales price, but that company, that organization still has to pay expenses before it can calculate its net profit. All right, so what else? From there, there's a long discussion about the external environment and how business really only makes sense within its environmental context, right? And so that is greatly affected by things in the external environment like the political elements, right? Like the economic elements, like the sociocultural elements, like the technological elements, right? So all of this was outlined in the text as well as one of the lecture videos, right? Excuse me. So be mindful of being able to identify elements in the external environment and how they might impact business, right? Many examples in the world today, right? Everything from the economic situation currently brewing in China and whether or not that will grow into something that affects businesses around the world, right? To what happens in, for instance, in the U.S. political scene, what happens in terms of who is in the administration in the White House and what that might mean for business and business decision-making. All those kinds of things are part of the environmental context of business, right? The next big thing we cover in this module has to do with planned versus market economies, right? Remember those things. And primarily, when we talk about planned versus market economies, we are really talking about an emphasis upon production decisions, right? Planned and market economies have certain structures in place for distribution and users to purchase those things, but really the big distinctives have to do with production, right? In a planned economy, what are we talking about? We're talking about a centralized decision-making agency making some or most or all of the important production decisions. What should get made? What should get produced? What resources should be committed to produce those things, right? Okay, so that, of course, is in contrast to the market economy, which says, well, the people or companies that own the means of production, they get to decide themselves, right? It's the whole Eric Cartman kind of thing. I do what I want. I do what I want, right? Or Malcolm in the Middle. You're not the boss of me now, right? I own the means of production. Therefore, I get to decide, since I own this thing, what I want to do with it. Whether I want to build automobiles or make shoes or, whatever it is that you want to do with your resources and the means of production. And of course, underlying this whole discussion, right, is the premise that the free market or a market economy protects and defends the right of private ownership of the means of production, right? That the state doesn't come in and take over and own the means of production, that private citizens can do that, and therefore that leads to private citizens being able to make production decisions, right? So those are the big distinctives, and you really should be able to discuss both the pros and the cons of both types of economies, right? There are good advantages to having a planned economy, and there are disadvantages. There are great advantages to having a market economy, and there are noted disadvantages. You should be able to discuss that intelligently, all right? What else? This is also the module we touched on, the law of supply and demand, right? And remember, in the law of supply and the law of demand, both of those things are driven by market prices, okay? So don't get that one backwards, right? I noticed that a few folks, when they answer those questions on the quiz, they sort of get that a little twisted around, right? What happens is, of course, in a market, the market price is set by the collision or the intersection of buyers and sellers, right? And the whole idea behind the law of supply is that as suppliers observe what happens with the market price, they react, they respond to that, right? And so if they see the invisible forces of the market driving market prices higher, they will tend to react by offering more quantity to the marketplace in order to sell more units. Whereas if suppliers observe market prices are falling, they will react to that. They'll respond to those falling prices by reducing the quantity supplied to the marketplace, right? Conversely, the law of demand says as we as buyers, right, as consumers, when we observe changes in market prices, we will respond to that. We'll react to that. If we are, we're hungry, we're going to get a cheeseburger meal, and normally that cheeseburger meal is a big fat cheeseburger, small fries, and a chocolate shake, right? If on a particular day we go to get that same meal and the market price has dropped, it becomes more attractive to us, all things being equal, right? If that is the exact same meal, right? Just the only change is the price is lower. Then we as an aggregate market will tend to want to buy more quantity of that, versus if we observe that market prices for that same meal are increasing, right? When we observe that, we will respond or react to that change by wanting to buy less as a market, as an aggregate, less quantity of that product in the marketplace. So it's the law of supply and demand, right? What else in Module 1? In Module 1, you are also dealing with different types or forms of market competition, right? So we had perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, monopoly. You should review that. You'll have a few questions on that in the exam as well. All right. That's pretty much what you see in Module 1, okay? There is one last thing in Module 1 about economic performance and national governments trying to create fiscal policy in such a way as to keep an economy stable, to introduce economic stability, right? Or maintain economic stability. But that's Module 1, okay? That was Module 1, our first week in class. All right. Module 2 is the chapter on ethics and corporate social responsibility. And so the point we are making in Module 2 right out of the gate, of course, is that ethics, when we use the term ethics, we're talking about personal, unique, individual beliefs about what is right and wrong, right? And so we all have a slightly or significantly different set of ethics from one another. We may agree on many things, and yet there will inexorably be things that you and I will individually may have a different opinion about what's right or wrong in this particular situation, right? And the only point here is that that means every business decision maker has their own personal, unique set of ethics that were developed over a long time, right? Over influenced by their parents and their friends and family, the schools they went to, how they grew up, right? And all those things, right? And when individuals with their own sets of ethics collide in an organization with organizational values, this is where ethics, business ethics, comes into play. How will I decide how to behave as a business decision maker with my own individual set of ethics and understanding of beliefs of what's right and wrong, and now having to make decisions in an organizational context, right? So we gave you a short little video in this module as well about how to increase your chances of staying out of jail, right? As well as, and you know, the answer to that essentially is understand how temptation works, right? And one of the other things in this module, of course, is the whole idea of maintaining organizational justice. And that is helping that your employees to perceive that your organization wants to promote fairness. And so there are at least 4 different axes we gave you to consider ethical behavior, right? We talked about utility and rights and justice and caring, ways for you to assess behavior and your choices, whether you believe this is an ethical decision or not, right? To consider these 4 different elements at least, right? And then when we talked about corporate social responsibility, right? We're talking about an organization's attempt to meet its ethical duties and responsibilities towards all of its stakeholders, whether they're customers or the natural environment or folks who live downstream from the river that I'm thinking about dumping chemical waste into, right? I mean, just lots and lots of folks are affected by your decisions as a business. They have a stake in the outcome. They're stakeholders, right? And so how you respond to these needs, right, and these duties and responsibilities, we talked about there being at least 4 major ways that business responds to these responsibilities, right? There is the obstructionist approach, the defensive approach, the accommodative approach, and the proactive approach. So you should review that and make sure that you're on top of what those categories mean and what those approaches seek to accomplish when an organization takes that particular approach, all right? Well, that is Module 1 and Module 2. So let's talk about Module number 3. Module number 3 is the module on business ownership forms, right? And of course, you know, at one level, it's pretty simple. In the United States, you can own a company in 3 different forms, right? Sole proprietorship, partnership, or corporation. Now, that being said, you should make sure you are well rehearsed in the pros and the cons of each form of ownership. You should be able to speak intelligently to, for instance, what are the advantages and disadvantages of corporate ownership, of owning your business as a corporation, right? So just make sure you rehearse each of those things to understand how that works. And you know, just as a side note, I'll note to you, there is no single best way, right? Many times folks will ask me, hey, I'm looking to start a business. Can you give me some advice? What's the best way to own it? And you know, I'll explain this to them and tell them, look, here are the pros and here are the cons. Here's what it accomplishes and here's what might be not so good about each of these forms. Which of these works for you and what you're trying to accomplish with your business, right? So just realize there is no one single best way to run a business. And that's one of the questions that came up in the discussion forum, right? What's the most successful way to structure your business? Is it sole proprietorship or is it corporation or partnership? And the answer is there's no single one answer. It depends how you describe success and what are your goals, right? So just keep that in mind. All right. So that's modules 1, 2, and 3. Finally, there is module 4 about international or global business. That's next, global business, right? And so what did we do in this module? What did we talk about? We talked about, you know, sort of the history of international trade and why at the end of World War II, we felt that promoting international trade might be a good way to prevent World War III from ever happening, right? We talked about that in the module. And as a result, we talked about, you know, attempts to regulate trade with, for instance, the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And some of you have asked in the discussion, why is it that we give the WTO, you know, a C- at best, right? That they haven't really been that effective at regulating international trade. And of course, the short answer to that is there's no enforcement. What good are rules if there's no enforcement of the rules in a court of law? And this is the major problem with the WTO, that when a country decides to say, hey, all that's great ideas, but I'm just not going to do that. Thanks so much for the suggestion, right? that, well, quite frankly, there's nothing the WTO can do about it, right? So what else? So that's sort of the answer to that question. But there are other things in this module as well. So for instance, we talked about the whole idea of absolute advantage versus comparative advantage and national competitive advantage, right? These are things that you really need to make sure you're conversant in the text and in those video lectures. And, you know, if you were ever to become, you know, sort of an expert or major in international business, you would spend a great deal of time studying those concepts. In this class, it's just sort of an overview, right? But just realize that's kind of big stuff, right? We spend a great deal of time then talking about different modes of entry into international markets, right? Exporting, licensing, joint ventures, FDI. You should study up on that. Make sure you're conversant in each of those four forms of market entry and what are the pros and cons of each of those modes, right? From there, we talked about cultural differences. You ought to take a quick look at that section on Gerda Hofstadter's study into cultural differences of people groups, right? And what are those 5 dimensions really talking about, right? And then finally, in this chapter, the idea of protectionist policies, right? For instance, tariffs versus quotas. What are you trying to accomplish with those things, right? That's pretty much what you're going to get questions on in that chapter. And you should be able, by the way, to also intelligently discuss the advantages and disadvantages of globalization. What do the various parties, that would be, for instance, companies and individuals, national governments, what do they each get out of globalization and what is at risk in globalization, right? So the pros and the cons, all right? The very last module we then cover in this midterm is module number 5 on management. And quite frankly, this is the last one we covered. So this stuff should be kind of fresh in your head, right? Okay, so we spent a little bit of time talking about why is management such an important topic to talk about? And many of you commented on that in the discussion forum that, yeah, this is really an important thing. So I want you to be able to discuss that intelligently, all right? What are the reasons, some of the reasons why management is such a crucial topic to deal with in any study of business, right? What else? We also talked about the 4 functions that managers do, the 4 classes of resources that managers supervise and allocate, right? And have control over. We talked about different types of managers. We talked about how to do planning and strategy. And for that, you should know what is the SWOT analysis process. So make sure you review that. What is SWOT? How do you accomplish a SWOT analysis? And what is the purpose of trying to perform those things, right? What are you trying to get at the end of a SWOT analysis, all right? That's pretty much the stuff you're going to get in this midterm. Modules 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I don't want this video to be too long, but I do want you to get a good sense of what I'm going to be asking you on this midterm so you can prepare for it adequately, all righty? So again, the midterm will be available to you in just a little bit today, Tuesday afternoon, and then from there, it will be open for you to take all the way out until Friday at 11:59 p.m. And of course, if you have any questions about any of this stuff, don't hesitate to holla, and I'll try to get back to you and answer any questions you have to have the very, very best success on this midterm exam. All righty? So go hit a home run, get a great grade on this exam, and we will see you in the next module. Take care.